I noticed it before I put my bag down. That's the part I keep coming back to. Before I'd hung up my coat, before I'd set the overnight bag beside the chair, before I'd done anything that constituted settling back into my own house after 4 days away, I noticed that something in the room was off. Not dramatically, not the way a room looks when someone has broken in. The way a room looks when someone has been in it carefully, deliberately, without wanting to leave obvious evidence. Small things. The stack of papers on the side table was squared at a different angle than I leave it. The second drawer of the bureau was closed completely, which I never do because it sticks, and I learned 20 years ago to leave it slightly open to avoid fighting with it every time. The reading lamp was at a lower angle than I set it. Someone had been through the room. Methodically, trying to be unobtrusive. Martin was already in the living room when I came in, sitting on the couch in the particular posture of a man who has been waiting longer than he expected to, and has rehearsed what he intends to say so many times that the rehearsal has made him rigid. He looked up when he heard the door. His expression was not what I expected. Not relief, which is what a son's face usually does when a father comes home from a medical stay. Not that. Elaine was standing beside the window. She'd chosen the window deliberately, I think. It gave her something to look at if the conversation became difficult. People who are anticipating difficult conversations choose positions that offer escape routes, even if the escape route is only visual. I set my bag down. Neither of them said the ordinary things. How was the drive? How are you feeling? Do you need anything? The ordinary things that a 4-day absence following a medical procedure usually produces were simply absent from the room, which told me everything about the quality of what was waiting. Then Elaine turned from the window and said, "George, before you sit down, there's something we need to explain." I looked at her. "About what?" She hesitated. That hesitation had a specific texture, not the hesitation of someone uncertain about whether to speak, but of someone uncertain about who should speak first. Martin said, "About the account." I went still. I had checked the balance that morning. Standing at the intake desk of the medical facility in Asheville, waiting for my discharge paperwork, I'd pulled up the account on my phone the way I check it every morning as a matter of habit. The habit of a civil engineer who spent 40 years understanding that the difference between a structure that holds and one that fails is almost always a measurement someone stopped taking regularly. The number I'd seen that morning was not the number I'd seen 4 days earlier. The difference was considerable. I had stood at that intake desk with the paperwork in one hand and the phone in the other, and I had looked at the number for about 30 seconds, not reacting, processing, running through the architecture of the situation the way I run through any structural problem, identifying what I knew, what I didn't know, what the possible explanations were, and which one was most consistent with the available evidence. By the time I'd signed the discharge forms and walked to my car, I had a reasonable working hypothesis. I hadn't confirmed it. But I'd been building structures long enough to know that when something unexpected appears in a load-bearing element, you don't assume it got there by accident. I reached into my coat pocket, removed the folded bank statement I'd printed at the facility's business center before I left, set it on the coffee table between us, smoothed it flat with 2 fingers. Neither of them moved toward it. I said, "I was wondering who was going to explain it to me." The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when everyone in them knows that what comes next will be permanent, that whatever is said in the next few minutes will exist between these people in a way that can be managed but not erased. I sat down. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be precise about that, because it matters to understanding what followed. I was 74 years old, and I had just spent 4 days receiving medical care, and I had come home to discover that money I'd been carefully managing for a purpose no one in this room knew about had been moved without my permission. And I sat down, calmly, and I looked at my son and my daughter-in-law, and I asked, "Before we talk about the money, tell me why you thought I wouldn't notice." Elaine looked at Martin. Martin looked at the bank statement. Nobody answered immediately, which was, in itself, the most informative thing that had happened since I walked through the door. Let me tell you about the account before I tell you what happened to it, because the account's history matters more to this story than the amount does. I opened it in 2009. Margaret was still alive then. We had another 4 years together before the diagnosis, and another 1.5 years after that before she was gone. The account was a standard savings vehicle, nothing complicated, built from the steady accumulation of a career that had never made me wealthy, but had made me careful. Civil engineering and municipal work does not produce fortunes. It produces a specific kind of person, someone who understands that the difference between a safe structure and a dangerous one is almost never dramatic, is almost never visible from the outside, and is almost always the result of decisions made quietly and correctly over a long period of time. That's how I built the account. Quietly, correctly, over time. Margaret knew it existed. We didn't keep financial secrets from each other. We'd been married 31 years by the time she died, and 31 years of shared life produces a financial transparency that isn't really a choice anymore, it's just the way things are. She knew the account's approximate balance. She knew I was careful with it. She knew I rarely touched it. What she didn't know in the last year of her life was that I had started thinking about what to do with it. She'd been involved with the Black Mountain Reading Room for almost a decade by then, volunteering twice a week in the way that Margaret did everything she committed to, completely, without half measures, without the tentative engagement of someone who isn't sure the cause deserves their full attention. She had decided the reading room deserved her full attention in 2011, after she attended an event there and came home and told me, in the direct way she had of saying things that mattered, "George, there are adults in that room who are learning to read, not struggling, learning, for the first time, in their 40s and 50s and 60s, and the place is falling apart around them." I'd asked her what she meant by falling apart. She'd described it with the precision of someone who had paid attention. Water damage on the north wall, insufficient lighting, shelving that was structurally inadequate, and that a small donation of skilled labor would resolve. She wasn't asking me to do anything. She was telling me what she'd seen, the way she always told me things, as information, not as a request, trusting that I would figure out what to do with it. I'd driven out to Black Mountain the following weekend. She was right about the structure. The north wall had moisture infiltration behind the paneling, not catastrophic, but progressive, the kind of damage that gets exponentially worse when it's ignored because water finds its own architecture inside a wall. The lighting was indeed inadequate for the kind of sustained reading the space required. The shelving was built from materials that had been selected for appearance rather than load capacity, which is a very common mistake in spaces where books are stored, because people underestimate what books weigh in aggregate. I'd fixed what I could that day, called in a few favors from contractors I knew through 30 years of municipal work. The north wall issue took about 3 weeks to properly address. The lighting took less time. The shelving I rebuilt almost entirely myself over 4 Saturdays. Margaret had never asked me to do any of it. She'd simply told me what she'd seen. And I had understood, without needing it explained, that this was the kind of place she believed deserved to continue existing. She died in 2014. In the months after, I did the things you do. I attended to the practicalities of a life that has lost its other half, the administrative architecture of grief, which is exhausting in a particular way because it keeps arriving with forms and decisions and phone calls at exactly the moments when you have the least capacity to handle them. I managed, I reduced, I settled. And when the settling was done, when the acute phase of that first year had passed into the longer, quieter kind of loss that simply becomes the texture of ordinary life, I sat down and thought about what I wanted to do with the remaining chapter of my own. Margaret had said something to me once during one of her volunteer sessions, when I'd come to pick her up and had stayed to watch the end of a writing class. A woman in her mid-50s was reading something she'd written. I don't remember the specific words, only the quality of her voice, which had in it something I can only describe as the sound of a person discovering that they have something worth saying. Margaret had noticed me watching. She'd leaned over and said quietly, "Some people don't need someone to rescue them. They just need one place where they can begin again." I wrote that sentence down when I got home. I still have it, in my handwriting, on a folded index card in the desk drawer. The reading room, in the years since Margaret's early work and my initial repairs, had continued. But it had continued the way things continue when they are sustained by will rather than resources, adequately in the sense that it remained open but not well in the sense that the structure had needs that occasional volunteerism couldn't fully address. There was a full restoration needed, not a renovation, a restoration, which is a meaningfully different thing. Restoration means understanding what something was built to be and returning it to that intention. Renovation means updating it. The reading room didn't need updating. It needed to be what it was originally meant to be, properly. I'd been quietly funding stages of that restoration for 3 years. Martin didn't know. Elaine certainly didn't know. I hadn't hidden it from them exactly. I simply hadn't told them, for reasons that seemed clear to me at the time, and that I was beginning, sitting in my living room with a bank statement on the coffee table and my son's eyes on the floor, to understand were perhaps less clear than I'd assumed. I am a private man by nature. That's a character trait that served me well in 40 years of professional work, where the ability to assess a situation completely before speaking about it is considered a competency. It served me less well in the years after Margaret died, when the people around me needed more transparency from me than silence could provide. And I kept offering silence because I'd forgotten to notice that the context had changed. I told myself I was protecting my private relationship with Margaret's memory from becoming a family obligation. That was true, partially. But underneath that was something less admirable. I didn't want to have to explain myself to my son, not because Martin was unreasonable. He isn't, fundamentally. Because explaining means acknowledging that someone else's understanding of your decision has weight. And I had grown accustomed, in the years since Margaret died, to making decisions in the full privacy of my own judgment, without the adjustment that comes when someone else is watching. That habit, it turned out, had costs I hadn't fully accounted for. Martin finally spoke. He said, "Dad, when you were away, Elaine found the authorization you'd signed years ago for emergency access." I remembered the authorization. I'd signed it in 2019, when I'd had a health scare that turned out to be less serious than initially feared, but that had produced a practical conversation about financial access during a medical event. I'd given Martin temporary access to a specific account for a specific, limited purpose. The authorization had been intended as a single-use arrangement. I had not rescinded it formally when the situation resolved. That was my administrative oversight. I own it. But administrative oversight is not the same as permission. I looked at Elaine. I asked her, "When you moved the money, did you believe you were stealing it?" She answered without hesitation, "No." "What did you believe you were doing?" She said, "Protecting you." I let that sit for a moment. Let the sentence be present in the room without rushing past it. Then I asked, "From whom?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. The question had done what I intended it to do, not as a trap, but as an honest inquiry, because the answer to that question was the center of everything. If she'd had an answer ready, a specific person or a circumstance or threat that she'd been protecting me from, the conversation would have been navigable. A misunderstanding can be corrected when both parties understand what was misunderstood, but the absence of an answer was something different. The absence of an answer meant that the protection had been general, undirected, which meant that the decision to move the money hadn't been a response to a specific threat. It had been a response to a general perception, the perception that George Whitaker's financial judgment had become something that needed to be managed. That perception, I was about to discover, had a longer history than a 4-day medical absence. Martin looked at his hands. He said quietly, "Dad, we'd been worried for a while." "Worried about what, specifically?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, the withdrawals. Over the past 3 years, we didn't understand them. We'd see these amounts moving out of the account, and we didn't know where they were going. And with the medical thing happening, and you being away, and Elaine having the access, we thought it was better to secure the money while we figured out what was happening. I looked at my son. I have known Martin for 47 years, which means I've known him longer than he's known himself in any complete sense. I was there when he was learning to read, which puts a particular kind of knowing into a relationship that never entirely goes away. I know the specific way his face looks when he's being honest about something uncomfortable versus when he's being honest about something he's decided in advance. This was the first kind. He was genuinely afraid. I could see that clearly. The fear that his father had been making large, unexplained financial decisions, combined with a medical event, combined with an old authorization that hadn't been formally closed, these things had come together in a way that produced an action he'd convinced himself was reasonable. That didn't make the action correct, but it made him human. And I have always believed that the appropriate response to a human mistake is to understand it before judging it. I picked up the bank statement from the coffee table, folded it, replaced it in my coat pocket. Then I said, "I'm going to make tea. And when I come back, I'm going to tell you what the money was for. And then I want you to tell me, honestly, not the version you've prepared, no, the honest version, exactly what you believed you were doing and exactly how you decided it was acceptable to do it without asking me first." I got up, walked to the kitchen. Behind me, the living room was very quiet, the kind of quiet that a house makes when the people inside it are adjusting to the fact that the conversation they prepared for has been replaced by a different one entirely, a harder one that requires more honesty than a folder of financial concerns and a temporarily secured account. I filled the kettle. Outside the kitchen window, Asheville in late autumn was doing what it does. The Blue Ridge in the middle distance, the tree line mostly bare now, the specific gray blue of the mountains on an overcast afternoon. I had lived with that view for 23 years. Margaret had always said it was the reason she agreed to buy the house on Hawthorne Terrace, that specific quality of the mountains visible from the kitchen window. I thought about the reading room. I thought about the restoration timeline, which I'd committed to funding in specific stages, and which the moved money had interrupted at a point that mattered. I thought about the index card in the desk drawer. Some people don't need someone to rescue them. They just need one place where they can begin again. And I thought about the conversation waiting for me in the living room, not as a confrontation, because that's not what I wanted it to be, but as the beginning of an explanation I should have given years earlier. An explanation whose absence had created a space large enough for fear to move into and make itself at home. The kettle began to heat. I stood at the window and thought about where to begin. Because there was something Martin didn't know yet, something Elaine didn't know. Not a secret in the dramatic sense, not a document in a drawer or a hidden account or any of the mechanisms that stories about family money tend to rely on. Something quieter and more important than any of that. The money they'd moved wasn't just earmarked for a building. It was the last payment in a promise I'd made to Margaret on the last coherent evening we'd had together, when the prognosis had become clear and we'd sat in the kitchen with the mountain view and talked about the things that still mattered and the things that could be let go. She'd said, "The reading room needs a proper floor. The one they have now is damaged, and it's going to keep getting worse." I'd said, "I'll take care of it." She'd looked at me. She knew what I meant. I meant that I would take care of it the way I'd taken care of everything she'd asked me to take care of without asking, quietly, completely, without drawing attention to it. She'd said, "Don't wait too long, George. Places like that don't survive on good intentions." The kettle reached temperature. I poured the water over the tea and stood there in the kitchen of my house and understood, with the clarity that occasionally arrives after 4 days of medical supervision and a balanced discrepancy in a living room full of carefully prepared concern, that the conversation I was about to have was going to have to include things I'd never told Martin, things I'd told myself were private, things that, in their absence, had left enough room for someone who loved me to make a decision that treated my judgment as something that could be temporarily suspended. I carried the tea back to the living room. Martin and Elaine were sitting where I'd left them. I set the cups on the table, sat down. I looked at my son. He was watching me with the expression of a man who is prepared for whatever comes next, but is not entirely sure it will be what he expects. He was right to be unsure, because the account they'd moved the money from, the account they'd seen as a financial irregularity requiring management, was connected to a story they'd never been told. A story that began in a room in Black Mountain with a woman reading something she'd written for the first time in her life, and a sentence Margaret had whispered to me, and a promise I'd made on an evening when the mountains outside the kitchen window had looked exactly the way they looked right now. I picked up my tea, and I said, "Let me tell you about your mother." Martin's expression changed when I said that. Not dramatically. He's not a dramatic man, which is something he got from me and which has served him about as well as it served me, meaning sometimes very well and sometimes not at all. But I saw it, the slight shift in how he was holding himself, the particular adjustment of a person who came into a room prepared for one kind of conversation and has just been told, quietly, that a different one is starting. Elaine looked at her hands. I said, "Not the version of her you already know, the version I knew before she told anyone else." I set my tea down, looked at the window for a moment, not at anything specific, just at the gray afternoon light coming through, the kind of light that makes everything in a room look considered. Then I looked back at Martin. I told him about the first time Margaret had mentioned the reading room, not the way I'd told it to myself across the years since, not the summarized, compressed version that a memory becomes when you've held it privately for a long time, the real version. The evening she came home from the event in Black Mountain, the specific quality of how she moved through the door and set her things down and stood in the kitchen with something on her face that I'd learned, across decades, to identify as the look of a person who has encountered something that has rearranged their sense of what matters. Martin said, "I remember her volunteering there. I didn't know it started that way." "You knew the fact," I said. "You didn't know the origin." He was quiet. That distinction, between knowing a fact and knowing its origin, was going to become important. I could feel it already, the way you feel a structural principle becoming relevant to a specific situation. The fact was that Margaret had volunteered at the reading room for nearly a decade. Martin had known that. He'd heard references to it across years of dinners and phone calls and holiday visits. But facts without origins are like buildings without foundations. They appear stable until the conditions change. I told him about driving out to Black Mountain that first weekend, about the north wall, about the lighting and the shelving. I didn't make it sound heroic. It wasn't, and Margaret would have found the framing embarrassing. I told it the way it happened. I saw a problem that was within my competence to address, and I addressed it. Martin said, "You fixed that place up, and you never mentioned it. Your mother mentioned it, to the people who used it. I was just the engineer." "Dad," he said it with a particular quality, not frustration exactly, but the sound of a son recognizing a pattern in his father that he's been circling for years without quite naming it. "I know," I said. Elaine had been listening without speaking, which was unusual for her. Elaine is a woman who processes verbally. She thinks out loud, refines her position through the act of articulating it. Her silence told me she was in a different mode than she usually occupied, the mode of someone who is receiving rather than managing. I took that as a good sign. I told them about the years of Margaret's involvement, about the writing class, and the woman reading aloud for the first time, about the sentence. Some people don't need someone to rescue them, they just need one place where they can begin again, and about writing it down on the index card that was still in the desk drawer 20 feet from where we were sitting. Martin's face did something specific when I said that, a particular movement around the eyes that meant he was receiving something he wasn't sure yet what to do with. I said, "She told me that on a Thursday evening in October. I've never forgotten it. I don't think I'm capable of forgetting it." He asked, "Why didn't you tell me she said it?" "Because it felt private," I said. Between your mother and me. The kind of thing that gets smaller when you repeat it in the wrong context. He looked like he wanted to push back on that. Looked like he was going to say something. Then he didn't, which told me he was deciding to hear the rest before he responded. That was good. That was actually the best thing I'd seen from him since I walked through the door. I told him about the last evening, the kitchen, the mountains, the prognosis that had become clear. I told it slowly. This is not the part of a story you compress. Some things deserve to take the time they take. Margaret had been tired that evening in a way that was different from ordinary tiredness. The specific fatigue of someone whose body is working very hard at something they did not choose and cannot stop. We'd sat in the kitchen because she preferred it to the living room at that point, something about the proportions of the space and the view and the quality of the light. We'd had tea. We'd talked about practical things first, the way you do when the impractical thing is too large to approach directly. Then she'd said, "The reading room needs a proper floor." I'd told her I'd take care of it. She'd said, "Don't wait too long, George. Places like that don't survive on good intentions." Martin was very still when I finished telling him this. Elaine was looking at the floor. I said, "The withdrawals you saw over the past 3 years were payments for stages of that restoration. I hired a contractor I trust. The work has been done in sections as the funding allowed. The final stage, the floor specifically, which was what your mother mentioned, was scheduled to begin next month. The money that was moved was committed to that stage. I had already signed the agreement." The room was quiet for a long enough time that I could hear the house settling around us. The specific sounds of an older home in cooling afternoon air, the small contractions of wood and plaster that have a rhythm I know as well as my own breathing. Martin said, "You were keeping a promise to Mom." "Yes." "For 3 years." "Yes." He looked at the bank statement, which I'd set on the table again when I returned with the tea. He didn't pick it up. He just looked at it. Then he said something I hadn't anticipated. He said, "I thought you were losing track of things." I looked at him. "The withdrawals?" he said. I convinced myself that you were making decisions that you might not have made if Mom was still here, that you were spending money in ways that weren't. That didn't make sense, and I told myself I was worried about you." He paused. "I told myself that because it was easier than saying what I was actually afraid of." "What were you actually afraid of?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment. I waited. This was the most important question I'd asked since I sat down, and I knew it. And I was patient in the way you're patient when you understand that the answer to a question matters enough to give it all the time it needs. Martin said that you were disappearing. The word landed in the room with a weight that surprised me. He said, "After Mom died, you got quieter. You stopped telling us things. You'd spend weekends away and not mention where you'd been. You'd have expenses on the account that didn't correspond to anything you'd talked about. And I told myself I was worried about your finances, because that was something I could actually do something about. But what I was really worried about was..." He stopped, started again. "I felt like you were leaving. Not physically, but like you were going somewhere I couldn't follow. And the money was the only tangible thing I could point to." I sat with that for a moment. There are things your son can say to you at 47 years old that would not have been possible for him to say at 25 or 35, because they require a kind of emotional vocabulary that some people only develop across the middle part of a life. What Martin had just said was one of those things. It was honest in a way that required him to be vulnerable in a way that didn't come easily to him. I knew that. I recognized the cost of it. I said, "I was going somewhere you couldn't follow. You're right about that." He looked at me. "After your mother died, I was working out what the rest of my life meant without her in it. And I did that privately because that's my nature and because I didn't know how to include you in a process I hadn't finished yet. The reading room was part of it. The promise I kept was part of it. I needed to..." I stopped, found the honest version. I needed to have something that was mine to carry. That was between Margaret and me. I wasn't trying to shut you out. I was trying to find a way to continue. Martin was quiet. Elaine looked up from the floor. She said, "And we interrupted it." "You moved the funding for the floor," I said, "which means I can't complete the commitment I made, which means the last thing your mother asked me to take care of is currently on hold." Elaine's expression changed considerably. I wasn't saying it to produce that effect. I was saying it because it was true and because I believed both of them needed to understand the actual consequence of the action rather than only the abstract principle. Abstract principles are important. Consequences are more instructive. She said, "George, we didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "That's the part I'm responsible for." This is the moment in the story where I want to be careful about something, because it would be easy, and I think dishonest, to present myself as the entirely wrong party in what happened. I was wronged. The money was moved without my permission and without adequate basis, and that was wrong in a way that Martin and Elaine both needed to understand and acknowledge. But I had also spent 3 years watching my son develop a growing anxiety about my financial decisions and doing nothing to address it. I had assumed my privacy was self-explanatory. I had assumed that a 74-year-old retired civil engineer making deliberate, staged financial commitments didn't owe anyone an explanation. That assumption, like most assumptions about what other people should simply understand, was incorrect. Margaret would have told me so. She was good at identifying the moments when I was confusing privacy with avoidance. She had a particular way of saying, without unkindness, "George, you've made a decision, and you've decided that decision speaks for itself. It doesn't. Say it." I hadn't said it. The cost of not saying it was sitting in my living room on a gray Asheville afternoon, looking at a bank statement and a son who had frightened himself into an action he'd spent 4 days trying to explain. I want to speak to you directly for a moment, because what I've just described is something I think many people recognize from their own families, even if the specific details are different. The pattern of a person doing something meaningful in private and assuming that people who love them will understand without explanation, that pattern is not unique to me. It's not unique to fathers or to older people or to anyone specific. It's a very human way of managing the things that matter most. We protect the important things by not exposing them to the scrutiny of other people's opinions. We tell ourselves that the people who know us should be able to read what we're doing from the fact that we're doing it carefully. They can't. Not always. And the gap between what we're doing and what the people watching us think we're doing is exactly where fear moves in. If you've ever been on either side of that gap, either doing the unexplained thing or watching someone you love make decisions you don't understand, then this story is yours to take something from. Stay with me, because what happened next was the thing I hadn't fully prepared for. After we'd been talking for a while, Elaine asked if she could say something, not with the peremptory quality she'd had when I walked in, not the organized, prepared quality of someone who has rehearsed their position, with the quality of someone who is working something out in real time. She said, "When I found the authorization and I called Martin, the first thing I said was, 'I think we should secure this before he gets back and spends more of it.' And Martin asked me why, and I said because we don't know what he's spending it on. And Martin said we should wait and ask you. And I said," she paused, "I said we didn't have time to wait." She looked at me. "We had 4 days," she said. "You were 4 days away? There was no emergency. There was no crisis. I said we didn't have time because I didn't want to wait, because I'd already decided what the situation was, and I didn't want to encounter information that would complicate it. That was a significant thing to say. The significance was in the specificity of it. She wasn't saying she'd made an error in general. She was identifying the precise moment and the precise mechanism of the error. The decision not to wait was the decision not to ask. And the decision not to ask was the decision that the situation had already been understood. I said, "That's a harder admission than most people would make." "I've been sitting here for 2 hours thinking about it," she said. "I had a lot of time, to be honest." Martin said, "Elaine convinced me it was the right thing to do. I want to be accurate about that. I had doubts, and she addressed them, and I let myself be convinced because I was afraid." He looked at his wife, not accusatorially. He wasn't transferring blame. He was being factual. Elaine said, "I know." The two of them looked at each other with the specific communication available to people who have been married long enough to have an entire conversation in a glance. I don't know everything that passed between them in that moment, but I know it included some kind of mutual acknowledgement that they were in this together, which was both true and the right way to be in it. I said, "I'm going to ask you both something, and I want honest answers. Not the answers you think I want, the true ones." They both waited. "Before you moved the money, did you consider calling me?" Martin said, "Yes." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Elaine thought it would upset you while you were getting medical care." And I agreed, partly, but mostly. He stopped. "Mostly I didn't call because I was afraid that if I called you, you'd tell me to leave it alone and I'd have to decide whether to listen to you or not. And I didn't want to be in that position." "So you made the decision before the call," I said, "to avoid having to make it after." "Yes." I looked at him, at my son, 47 years old, sitting in the house where I'd raised him, who had loved his father well enough to worry about him and not well enough to ask him a question before acting on the worry. I said, "Martin, when you were 17, you borrowed my truck without asking, and you dented the rear quarter panel. Do you remember what I asked you then?" He looked surprised by the question. Then he almost smiled, despite everything. "You asked me why I didn't ask." "And you said?" I said I thought you'd say no. "And what did I actually say?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You said you probably would have said yes." "I would have," I said. "Not to everything, but to most things, if you'd asked. The asking was never the obstacle. The assumption that the asking would produce the wrong answer, that was the obstacle." He sat with that. 30 years between that conversation about a dented truck and this one about a moved bank account, and the mechanism was identical. The assumption that asking would produce the wrong answer. The decision to act first and address the question later, the faith that the outcome would justify the method. It doesn't always. I reached into my jacket pocket and removed the index card. The one I'd mentioned, Margaret's sentence written in my handwriting, folded and carried in that desk drawer for years and brought with me to the medical facility because it was in my coat when I packed. I set it on the table. Martin picked it up, read it. His expression did the thing again, the movement around the eyes that meant something was arriving that he didn't quite have a category for. He handed it to Elaine. She read it, set it down. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Martin said, "The floor." "Yes," I said. "That's what she wanted." "The last specific thing she mentioned?" He looked at the card. "How much is needed to complete it?" I told him the figure. He looked at Elaine. She looked at him. He said, "I'll transfer it back today." "Not yet," I said. He looked at me. "I want you to understand something first," I said. "Not as a condition. I don't have conditions. But because I want to say it while we're all here and while you're still in the position of actually hearing it." I looked at Martin, then at Elaine. Then I said the thing I'd been formulating since I stood at the discharge desk that morning and looked at the number on my phone and felt something I had to be precise about before I named it. I said, "The money matters. It matters because it has a purpose and because moving it disrupted something I care about deeply. But the money is not what I'm most disturbed by." They waited. "What I'm most disturbed by," I said, "is that somewhere in the past several months, the two of you sat down together and made decisions about my life. What I should stop spending money on, what I should consolidate, what I could afford, where I should live." I paused. I don't know all of the specifics of those conversations, but I know they happened because the way Elaine was standing at that window when I walked in this afternoon and the way Martin was sitting on that couch was the posture of people who have had those conversations. Neither of them denied it. Martin said, "We were worried." "I know," I said, "and being worried about someone is not wrong. But there's a distance between being worried about someone and designing a version of their future without asking them what they want. You cross that distance, and the crossing happened so gradually that I don't think either of you noticed the exact moment it happened." Elaine said, "You're right." 2 words, direct, without qualification. I looked at her. "Tell me what you understand by that." She thought about it. "I started thinking about what George should do," she said. "Not with George, about him, like he was a situation to be managed rather than a person to have a conversation with." "Yes," I said. "That's it exactly." "And I didn't notice I was doing it," she said, "because I told myself it was helping, because helping felt like the right word for it." I said, "There's a sentence I want you to remember. Not mine, Margaret's. She said some people don't need someone to rescue them. They just need one place where they can begin again." I looked at Elaine. She was talking about the adults at the reading room, but she could have been talking about anyone who needs to be treated as a person rather than a problem. The room was quiet. Outside, the afternoon was darkening into the early winter evening that Asheville does in November, the mountains going blue and then gray and then simply shapes against a darker sky. The kind of evening that makes the inside of a house feel important, the warmth of it, the specific quality of a space where people have lived for a long time. Martin said, "Dad, I want you to give me back the right to make my own mistakes." I looked at him. He said, I need to say something, and I'm going to say it wrong probably, but I need to say it." "Go ahead," I said. He said, "I've been treating you like you're already leaving, like you're in some kind of final phase, and I've been making decisions based on that. And sitting here, listening to you talk about Mom and the reading room and the promise and the index card, I realized that I was so focused on the fact that you're 74 and you had a medical procedure that I completely stopped seeing." He paused. "I stopped seeing that you're still here, that you're still making decisions and keeping promises and doing work that matters. I was already..." He stopped again. "Already managing my exit," I said. He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. "Yes." The honesty of that cost him something. I could see it, the specific cost of saying something true that you've been avoiding. I respected it. I respected it more than I would have respected a smoother version. I said, "I want you to give me back the right to make my own mistakes." He looked up. "That's what I want back," I said. "Not just the money. I want you to trust that when I make a decision about my own life, even a decision you don't fully understand, your first response will be to ask rather than to act. I can make mistakes. I've made them before and I'll make them again, but they need to be mine." Martin looked at his father for a long time. Then he said, "Yes." Not elaborated, not qualified, just yes, which was the right answer. The money would come back. That was clear, and it would happen. And the restoration timeline would be adjusted and the floor would be done one way or another, because I had made a promise that I intended to keep. But there was something else in that room that I hadn't mentioned yet, something neither Martin nor Elaine knew. In the desk drawer, behind the index card, there was a letter. Not from Margaret. She hadn't been a letter writer. She was too direct for letters. She preferred to say things to your face when she could and leave them unsaid when she couldn't. The letter was from me, to no one, written about 6 months ago on a Sunday afternoon when I'd come back from a site visit to the reading room and sat down at the desk and understood something that I wanted to put into words before it became vague. It wasn't a legal document. It wasn't a will or a financial instrument or anything that would fit neatly into the category of things families argue about. It was just a letter about what I wanted the last chapter of my life to look like, in specifics. In the honest, particular detail of a man who has spent 40 years thinking about structures and who had finally turned that kind of attention toward the structure of his own remaining time. Martin didn't know it existed, but in the days that were coming, after the money was returned and the floor was scheduled and the initial urgency of this afternoon settled into something more navigable, he was going to ask me a question I hadn't anticipated from him that would come from a different place than the folder and the authorization and the prepared posture on the couch. He was going to ask what I actually wanted. Not for the money, for the time. And when he asked it, I was going to have an answer ready. Because for the first time in 3 years, my son was finally asking the right question. Martin transferred the money back that evening. Not the following day, not after sleeping on it, not after a conversation with Elaine about timing or logistics. That evening. He took out his phone while we were still sitting in the living room, made the transfer, turned the screen toward me so I could see the confirmation number. No ceremony around it, no speech, just the action. Clean and immediate, which was the right way to do it. I wrote down the confirmation number, folded it, put it in my coat pocket beside the bank statement. Then I said, "Thank you." 2 words, no elaboration. The moment didn't need more than that. Elaine asked if I wanted her to heat something for dinner. It was a practical question offered in a way that was also something else, an attempt to return the room to ordinary life, to move from the territory of confrontation into the territory of people who have said difficult things and are now trying to remember how to be a family again. I recognized the attempt and I appreciated it. I said yes, whatever she could find in the kitchen was fine. She went to cook. Martin and I sat in the living room in the kind of silence that follows a significant conversation. Not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of 2 people who have said a great deal and are now simply present with each other in the aftermath of it. That kind of silence is not uncomfortable when the conversation that preceded it was honest. It has a different quality, more like rest than avoidance. Martin said, after a while, "The medical thing. Is it serious?" "Manageable," I said. "It requires monitoring and some adjustments. Nothing that changes the fundamental situation." He nodded. "I should have told you more about it," I said. "You don't have to tell me everything." "No, but I should tell you enough so that your imagination doesn't fill in the gaps with something worse than what's actually there." I looked at him. That's another version of the same problem. My silence creates space for your fear, and your fear creates decisions that neither of us would have chosen in a better informed conversation. He said, "I'll try to ask before I assume. And I'll try to say before you have to ask." We looked at each other across the coffee table where the bank statement had been. The statement was in my pocket now. The room looked ordinary again. Just a living room, just 2 men. Just an evening in November in Asheville with the mountains going dark outside and something beginning to heat up in the kitchen. Ordinary, which is what it should have been all along. I want to tell you what happened in the weeks that followed because the evening of my return was not the end of anything. It was, if I'm being accurate, the beginning of the more difficult part. The confrontation had a shape to it. There was a problem, there was a conversation, there was an acknowledgement and a correction. Clean, if not comfortable. What came after was less structured, which meant it required more sustained effort from everyone involved. Trust, I have learned, does not restore itself in a single session. It restores the way a damaged structure restores, slowly, in stages, with attention to what's underneath the surface rather than just what's visible. You can patch the surface quickly. The underlying work takes longer. 3 days after I returned home, Martin called and asked if he could come by. Not with Elaine, just him. He arrived on a Saturday morning, which is when he used to come by before all of this had started, before the worry had made his visits into something slightly different from what they'd always been. He came in and made his own coffee, which he knows how to do in my kitchen the way you know how to do things in a house you spent 18 years in. He stood at the counter while the coffee brewed, and he said, without turning around, "I went through Mom's things last night." I didn't respond immediately. I waited. He said, "Not all of it." I know you've kept most of her things the way she had them. I went into the study and I looked at the bookshelves. I read the spines. I hadn't done that before. I'd seen them, but I hadn't actually read them. He poured his coffee, turned around. She had a lot of books about adult literacy. She did, I said. I didn't know that. She collected them for about 8 years. Whenever she found something useful, she'd order it. Sometimes she donated them to the reading room. Sometimes she kept them for her own reference. He sat down at the kitchen table, looked at the mountain view the way Margaret always looked at it, not casually, but with attention. He said, I never understood why she cared so much about that specific thing. Adult literacy. There are a lot of causes. That one specifically. I thought about how to answer that. Not whether to answer. The time for deciding whether to share things had ended in the living room 3 days ago. But how? I said, Your mother didn't learn to read until she was 9 years old. He looked up. Not because of any learning difficulty, I said. Her family moved frequently during her early years. She missed significant portions of school. By the time things settled down, she was behind in a way that the schools she attended didn't have the resources to address properly. She spent several years knowing she was behind without understanding why and without anyone explaining it to her or helping her catch up. I paused. She caught herself up. On her own, mostly. By the time I met her, she was one of the most capable readers I'd ever known. But she remembered what it felt like. Martin sat very still. She never told me that, he said. She didn't tell many people. It wasn't a story she led with. But it was why the reading room wasn't abstract to her. It wasn't a cause she'd chosen from a distance. It was something she understood from the inside. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, And you kept that too, all these years. It was hers to tell or not tell. After she was gone, it was mine to protect or share. I've been thinking about which it should be. I looked at him. I've decided it should be shared with you. Because you're her son and because understanding where she came from changes how you understand where she went. He looked at the mountain view. I watched my son sit with the fact that his mother had carried something for her entire life that he hadn't known about. Not a secret in the dramatic sense, but a private history that had shaped everything she cared about, that he had been in proximity to for 47 years without knowing it was there. That's the thing about the people closest to us. We think we know them fully because we have known them longest. And then, in a kitchen on a Saturday morning, the full picture arrives in a single sentence, and you understand that length of time is not the same as depth of knowledge, that the people who love us most have histories inside them that we haven't asked about, that asking is a form of love that we frequently forget to practice. He said, Dad, I want to ask you something. Go ahead. He looked at me directly. What do you actually want? Not for the money, for the time. What does the rest of your life look like to you when you imagine it the way you want it? I held that question for a moment, because it was, as I'd understood it would be when I heard it in my mind 3 days ago, the right question, the question he hadn't known to ask before any of this had happened, the question that had been missing from the conversation about the account and the authorization and the restoration stages and the floor, the question underneath all of it. I reached into the desk drawer and removed the letter. Not the index card, the other one. The letter I'd written to no one on a Sunday afternoon 6 months ago. I held it for a moment. Then I slid it across the table to Martin. He looked at it. What is this? Something I wrote for myself, I said. About 6 months ago. I wasn't intending to show it to anyone. But you asked the right question, and the right answer to the right question is the honest one. He picked it up, opened it. I got up and stood at the window while he read it. Not because I was nervous. I'd moved past nervous sometime during the previous 3 days. But because the letter was personal in a way that required me to give him some privacy with it. Some letters need to be read without the author watching. I looked at the mountains, at the specific gray-blue of the Blue Ridge in a November morning, a color that exists in that particular form only in that particular place, and that I have spent 23 years looking at with the gratitude of a man who knows he chose well when he chose where to live. Margaret had loved that view. I heard Martin turn a page. The letter wasn't long, 4 pages in my handwriting, which is more compressed than it used to be, but still legible, the handwriting of an engineer who spent decades putting precise annotations on structural drawings. In it, I had written, as specifically as I could manage, what I wanted the remaining time to look like. I wanted to finish the reading room. That was first, and it was non-negotiable, and I'd written it in those terms. I wanted to stay in the house on Hawthorne Terrace for as long as I was capable of maintaining it responsibly. Not forever. I was realistic about the fact that there would eventually be a point when that calculation changed, but I wanted to be the one who made that assessment, on my own terms, when the time came, not in advance of the necessity. I wanted to see Martin more, not out of obligation. I'd written that explicitly, underlining it once. Not visits that felt like monitoring. Visits that felt like a father and a son spending time together because they both wanted to. I wanted, when I eventually could no longer manage the reading room's financial involvement alone, to involve Martin in it, not as a handoff, as a partnership. I'd written about what that could look like. The scholarship program that had been in the back of my mind for years. A modest fund that could continue the work Margaret had cared about after I was no longer able to sustain it directly. And at the end, I'd written something that I hadn't planned to write when I sat down. It had arrived in the writing the way the truest things sometimes do. Not constructed, but found. I had written, "The thing I am most afraid of is not dying." I have thought about that enough to be at peace with it in the way that a person can be. What I am afraid of is becoming invisible before I am gone, of having the people who love me begin to look through me rather than at me, of my decisions being discussed rather than asked about, of my future being arranged while I am still here to have one. Margaret never let me feel that way. And the greatest tribute I know how to pay to what she built in me is to insist, quietly and without apology, on remaining present for as long as I am here. I heard Martin stop turning pages. The kitchen was quiet for a while. Then he said, and his voice had a quality it doesn't usually have. Not broken, that's not quite right, but open in a way that his voice isn't always open. "You wrote this 6 months ago?" "Yes." "Before any of this happened?" "Yes." "You already knew," he said, "that this was coming." I turned from the window. I knew the direction things were moving. I didn't know the specific form it would take. But when someone you love starts describing your life in the future, tense without asking you about it, you learn to recognize the pattern. He set the letter flat on the table. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad." The specific quality of that apology was different from the ones that had been offered in the past 3 days. Those had been genuine, but they'd been about actions, about the money, about the authorization, about specific decisions made without permission. This one was about something underneath all of that, about the pattern, about the direction of attention, about the slow drift over months and years from seeing a father to managing a situation. I said, "I know." He said, "The part about being invisible, that..." He stopped, started again. I didn't understand that I was doing that. I thought I was being responsible. I thought, another stop. I've been so focused on making sure things would be okay that I stopped asking if you were okay. "The two questions are different," I said. "I know that now." I sat back down at the table, poured more coffee into both our cups without asking. I said, "Martin, I'm going to tell you something that I want you to hold on to. Not as a comfort, as a fact." He waited. "The things you did in the past few weeks, the authorization, the transfer, the plan you and Elaine had made about my finances, those things were wrong. Not because you were wrong to be worried, but because worry without consent is not help. It's control, even when the control comes from love." I paused. "But the fact that you were worried means you were paying attention. And the fact that you're sitting in this kitchen right now asking what I actually want means something changed. I can work with a person who asks. I cannot work with a person who decides." He was quiet. "You asked," I said. "That matters." He looked at the letter on the table, then at me. "The scholarship thing you wrote about, at the end." "Yes." "The fund for continuing Mom's work. Eventually, when the time comes, could we..." He paused, chose the words carefully. "Could we start talking about that, together, not me deciding, you deciding, with me in the room?" I looked at my son, 47 years old, sitting at a kitchen table with a mountain view, holding a letter his father wrote alone on a Sunday afternoon, because he'd needed somewhere to put the things he hadn't yet said out loud. I said, "Yes, that's exactly what I was hoping for." 3 weeks after that Saturday morning conversation, Martin drove with me to Black Mountain. He didn't bring Elaine that first time. She asked if she should come, and he said he thought the first visit should be just the two of them, which was the right instinct. Some things need to arrive in their proper sequence. The restoration was at the stage I'd managed to schedule once the funding was returned and the contractor rearranged the timeline. The main structural work was finished. The floor installation was scheduled to begin in 10 days. What remained was the interior finishing, the shelving restoration, the lighting adjustments, the small repair work that gets done in the final stage of a project like this. I showed Martin around the space. He was quiet as we moved through it. He looked at things the way people look at things when they're trying to understand them, rather than just see them, stopping at details, asking questions about specific decisions, noticing the quality of the work in a way that told me he'd inherited more of his father's professional attention than I'd given him credit for. He stopped at the shelving along the east wall. He looked at the construction, the joinery, the way the load was distributed across the bracket system. He said, "You built this?" 15 years ago, I said. "Your mother asked me to. She'd found a set of old shelves that someone had discarded and she thought they could be restored. We replaced most of the material but kept the original profile. He ran his hand along the edge of a shelf. The gesture of a person touching something they've suddenly understood is more than what it appears. He said, "It's solid." "It'll outlast both of us," I said. He turned from the shelving and looked at the room, at the restored plaster, at the light fixtures I'd specified for their quality and their appropriateness to the space, at the floor, still unfinished, marked out for the installation that was coming. He said, "Mom must have loved this place." She did, but not in the way people love places they own, in the way people love places they believe in. He looked at me. "There's a difference," I said. "Places you own, you protect. Places you believe in, you build. She built this in the way that matters. She gave it attention and care and years of her time. The money I put in was secondary to that. It was just the structural support for what she'd already committed." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I thought you were throwing money at a building." "I know," I said. "I didn't understand what was inside it. That's why I should have told you." He looked at me. "And I should have asked." We stood there in the unfinished reading room in Black Mountain for a while, not talking, just being in the space together. The particular quality of a room mid-restoration, not finished but clearly becoming something, has always appealed to me. It's the moment of greatest possibility, the moment when the potential and the actual are closest together. Martin pointed to a small, framed photograph on the wall near the door. Margaret, taken sometime in her mid-60s, standing in this room with 3 other volunteers. She was looking at something off camera, not at the photographer. Her expression was the one I remembered best from the last years of her life. The expression of a person completely present in what they're doing, unconcerned with how it appears from the outside. Martin looked at the photograph for a long time. He said, "I forgot she looked like that." "Like what?" "Like herself, doing something she believed in." He paused. "Most of my memories of her are from home, from family things. I forgot that she was someone outside of being my mother." I said, "She was someone for 30 years before she was anyone's mother. That person didn't stop when the mother began." He was quiet. "The reading room was where that first person went," I said. "The one who understood something from the inside about what it meant to need a place to begin again." He nodded slowly. Elaine came to Black Mountain on the 3rd visit. She walked through the space with the careful attention she brings to everything, the specific attention of a woman who organizes things for a living and who cannot enter a room without assessing its function. But something was different about how she applied that attention here. It wasn't the assessing attention of someone identifying what should be changed. It was the attention of someone trying to understand what a space is for. She stopped at the central table, the one that would be the main reading and writing surface for the classes. A long oak table, restored from a piece that had been in the original building since the 70s, and that had survived several renovation cycles because no one had ever quite decided to replace it. She said, "This is where they sit." "For the writing class," I said, "and the literacy sessions." She put both hands flat on the table surface, looked at them, then she said, "George, I want to help with the reopening." I looked at her. "Not to manage it," she said quickly. I understand the difference now. I want to help in the way that's actually useful. Organizing the event logistics, notifying people, setting up the space." She looked at me. "If you'll let me." I said, "I think Margaret would have liked that." She nodded once. Then she said, "I still think you should have told us." "I agree. But we had no right to decide for you." "No," I said. "You didn't." She looked at the photograph near the door, at Margaret, looking at something off camera with her full attention. She said, "She was remarkable." "She was," I said. "She was also occasionally infuriating and sometimes wrong and always certain she was right even when she wasn't. She was a full person, not a memory yet." Elaine smiled, slightly, carefully. The smile of someone allowing themselves a moment of warmth after a period of difficulty. "I'll take that," I thought. "That's enough for now." The reading room reopened on a Friday evening in early December. Martin drove me. Elaine had spent 2 days arranging the logistics, the notification to the existing program participants, the lighting, the small reception afterward. She'd done it with the organizational efficiency that is genuinely her gift, applied this time to something other than a financial plan. She'd asked questions at every step. Not presumptuous questions, practical ones, the kind that required my input to answer. That was different. That was better. The floor was finished. The contractor had done it right. White oak, properly fitted, appropriate to the age and character of the space. Margaret had wanted a proper floor. It was proper. I stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. The room was full of people. adults who attended the literacy and writing programs, volunteers who had kept the place running across the years when the structural work was being done in stages, the program coordinator, a woman named Alice, who had been running the reading classes for 11 years, and who greeted me with the specific warmth of someone who has understood for years that I was the anonymous donor, and had respected the anonymity, and was now, with the formality of the public occasion, allowing the recognition to be mutual. She said, "George, we wouldn't be standing in a finished room without you." I said, "You would have found another way. That's what places like this do." She smiled. "Maybe, but this way was better." Martin was beside me. He looked around the room at the people in it, the adults attending the programs, the volunteers, the finished shelving and the proper lighting and the white oak floor, and I watched him take it in the way he'd been taking things in across the past weeks, with the particular attention of a person who is learning to see what has always been there but not looked at carefully. He said quietly, "This is what the money was for." "This is what the money was for," I said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I understand now." I looked at him. "What do you understand specifically?" He thought about it. "You weren't spending money on a building. You were keeping a promise inside a building." "Yes, and the promise was more important than the amount." "The promise was the only thing that was important," I said. "The amount was just how promises get kept in the physical world." He nodded. We went inside. Months later, past the reopening, past the holidays, past the adjustment period that follows any significant family reckoning, I was sitting in the reading room on a Thursday afternoon. The room is open to the public on Thursday afternoons for independent reading and writing. I'd started coming on Thursdays about 6 weeks after the reopening, not to volunteer, not to manage anything, just to sit in the space and be in it the way Margaret had been in it, to experience what she had experienced in the ordinary hours of the place, rather than only in the event of its restoration. Martin came by that Thursday. He didn't tell me he was coming. He sent a message when he was already in Black Mountain, asking if I was at the room. I said yes. He came in 20 minutes later, nodded to Alice at the desk, and sat down across from me at the long oak table. He was carrying tools, a small repair kit, the kind of kit a man brings when he's heard something needs fixing and has decided to fix it before being asked. Alice had mentioned to him, apparently, during a phone call the previous week, that one of the shelving brackets on the west wall was showing some wear. It wasn't an urgent repair. It was the kind of thing that gets on a maintenance list and gets addressed when someone gets around to it. Martin had gotten around to it before being asked. I watched him go to the west wall, examine the bracket, take out the appropriate tool, begin the work with the patient, methodical quality of a man who has decided to do something right. He worked for about 40 minutes. I read. The room was quiet, in the way reading rooms are quiet. The particular quality of silence that exists in a space where people are actively using their minds, where the absence of conversation is not emptiness, but concentration. When Martin finished, he came back to the table, sat down. He looked at the room the way I'd been looking at it, with the attention of someone who has begun to understand what they're looking at. He said, "Do you still want me to have this someday? The involvement? The fund? The continuation of it?" I looked at my son. "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a moment, even after everything that happened. "Especially after everything that happened," I said. "Now I know you understand the difference between managing something and caring for it." He looked at the repaired bracket on the west wall, then at the photograph of Margaret near the door. He said, "I think I'm starting to." The reading room was quiet around us. Outside, the December afternoon was doing what December afternoons do in western North Carolina. The light going low and gold early, the mountains in the distance taking on the color they take at this time of year. A blue so specific to this latitude and this season that I've never found a satisfactory word for it. I thought about the bank statement I'd folded into my coat pocket the evening I came home. I thought about Martin on the couch with his rehearsed posture. Elaine at the window. The specific silence after I asked why they'd thought I wouldn't notice. I thought about what I'd said in the letter I'd written alone on a Sunday afternoon. That what I was most afraid of was becoming invisible before I was gone. Of having the people who loved me begin to make decisions about my life while I was still living it. They had done that. And then something had happened that I hadn't written in the letter because I hadn't known to anticipate it. They had stopped. Not perfectly. Nothing in a family is perfect, and I had not arrived at the age of 74 expecting perfection from people who were doing their best with the information they had. But meaningfully, in the direction of something better. Martin had asked what I wanted before deciding what I should have. Elaine had helped with the reopening by asking questions rather than managing outcomes. The money had come back. The floor was done. The room was open. And I was sitting in it on a Thursday afternoon with my son, who was learning, slowly, imperfectly, in the way that all learning actually happens, what it means to care for something rather than manage it. The final thing I understood, sitting at the long oak table with the December light coming through the restored windows, was this. They hadn't taken my money while I was away. Not really. Not ultimately. What they had taken, what had actually gone missing, was the assumption we'd all been operating under without knowing it. The assumption that the people who love each other will always ask before they decide. That love makes consultation automatic. That family means no one will design your future without your input. That assumption had been taken from me the morning I came home to Martin on the couch, and Elaine at the window and the bank statement in my coat pocket. And recovering it, rebuilding it, with the specific work that rebuilding requires, had cost more than the money and produced something more valuable than any restored floor. It had produced a family that was finally, honestly, talking about the things that mattered before they became the things that had gone wrong. Margaret would have said that was worth whatever it cost. She'd have been right. She usually was. If this story reached something in you, if you've ever come home to discover that someone who loves you had made a decision about your life while you were away, or if you've ever been the person who made that decision believing you were helping, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me which part of George's story you recognized. Tell me about the promise you've been keeping, or the one you wish someone had told you about sooner. Tell me what you would have asked, or what you wish you'd been asked before someone decided for you. The conversation that should have happened before it had to happen. That's what this story is about. And sometimes the place that conversation finally arrives is in a comment section between strangers who recognize each other across the distance of a shared experience. I read everyone. And if you want to keep hearing stories like this one, stories about ordinary families navigating the extraordinary difficulty of loving each other honestly across the years, subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell so you're there when the next one arrives. Every story I bring you is built the way a good structure is built, with attention to what's underneath, respect for what was there before, and patience for what takes time to become what it was always meant to be. I'll see you in the next one.